Hey there, and welcome to Grandma Has ADHD. I am your host, Justin, and with me, as always, I'm just kidding. I'm taking over today to do the introduction, but Jami is really your host, and I am here as a co-host and moral support. But welcome to episode 2 of our inaugural podcast of Grandma Has ADHD. Hopefully, you got a lot of good information from the first one. This episode will not be as long as that one, but still a lot of really great things that we're going to talk about. So, with that said, let me bring Jami on and welcome you back to your show.
Why, thank you. And I don't just have you here to be a co host, I also have you here to be comic relief. And if I'm being completely honest, Justin on TikTok is pretty famous with his about 1,400,000 followers. And
Who's counting?
so he's also, if we're being really, really honest, he has production experience. And I just didn't have the bandwidth to also figure out how to record a podcast, run a business, and produce a podcast. So Justin has the title of producer. But thank you so much for having me today and being listening with us. And we're going to jump back in. If you hopefully listened to the inaugural 1 episode, and now we're going to go into inaugural 2. So with that being said, Justin, or Vanna, as I like to call you, can you please
You,
put up the screen?
you have literally never called me that until this moment, ever.
But now that's your new nickname, Vanna.
Um, do you really want to go down that route?
Why not?
All right, I'm gonna start brainstorming what to call you.
Oh, it's fine. You already call me Boomer. Like, really. By the way, just for context, I'm 12 years older than Justin, if you didn't listen to the first
Almost 12 and
episode.
a half.
Right, exactly. And Justin's math, it's really 50. But I am a Gen X and he is a millennial. Like, let's really call some names. But
Being a
anyway,
millennial isn't a problem, especially an older millennial.
okay. Well, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But so where we left you is we played this or that, which is sort of traits that go with ADHD. And this is a continuation of a talk that I have been delivering around San Diego to San Diegans who are discovering that seniors can also have ADHD. So the slide that we have up, if you are listening on the podcast, is the impetus for this Grandma Has ADHD talk. So I was in it's a couple years ago. I'm in a client's house and I'm touring his house as he's showing me all of the things that he needs to do to get ready for his move so that we can look around and given an idea of how much it's going to cost for my company, Silver Linings Transitions, to go in and help him move. So we get to the kitchen and I look at his stove and all of a sudden I'm like in the middle of it. I'm like, I left my eggs on my gas burning stove at my house 3 hours earlier. And I mean, he can see the sheer panic in my face. And I look at him and I'm like, I'm so sorry to do this, but I just remembered I left boiling eggs on my gas stove. I'm going to have to leave you in the middle of this appointment where I'm trying to get your business and go home and deal with this. Because in my mind, I have blown up the house. The eggs have, if I'm lucky, the worst thing that's happened is that the eggs have hit the ceiling. But, I was working with a senior client who I suspected had ADHD. And, I said, if you had left boiling eggs on a gas stove, what would they have said about you? What do you think that her answer was, Justin?
They would have made her get a lobotomy.
They wouldn't have made her get a lobotomy, but they would
Well,
have
that's how we used
accused
to
her.
handle things.
Huh? No,
That's
they would have accused her of having dementia.
probably.
So, right. And actually, sadly, about 1 in 5 memory care clinics are even routinely asking questions about ADHD. And in the book that you're going to hear me reference a lot, because it's the only one that exists on the subject by Dr. Kathleen Nadeau, and we've had her as a guest on the podcast, which will be upcoming. It's not on the inaugural episodes, but she actually shared that we really aren't properly screening and there are people who are being misdiagnosed and they actually have ADHD and not dementia. So I think it's really, really important that seniors and people who work with seniors and people who love seniors are aware of the difference. So that was a little bit of the impetus for the talk. But the other impetus for the talk is, as a senior move manager and home organizer, I do a lot of talks around, actually not just in San Diego, though I do a lot of speaking in San Diego since that's where my company is based. And I used to say that my mom had hoarding disorder because if you looked at my mom's home, she literally had, and these are pictures, she had stuff everywhere, piled everywhere. And it wasn't until January or actually December or January of this year. So I've known for 7 or 8 years that I personally have ADHD when my oldest child was diagnosed. knew that Justin and we are brother, sister from another mother. We share a father and he has ADHD. So I just assumed that I got it from my dad. And it really wasn't until just recent months that I made the connection that my mom has ADHD. And, looking around her home with ADHD in mind, I started to see that a lot of my mom's piles were just projects. So my mom would get super crafty. She'd get excited about a project. She'd buy everything she needed for the project, and then she'd get bored of the project, and then she'd move on to the next project, which is a very common trait of ADHD. And then you'll see, if you are watching the slideshow, there's a round to it, which I remember growing up, my mom was constantly saying, "Oh, I'm going to get around to this. I'm going to get around to this." And finally, I've lost my patience with my mom. And I'm like, "Mom, here is your round to it. Finally, I hope that you will finish all of these things that you've been saying that you're going to finish." So discovering that my mom had ADHD really was the second impetus for this talk, which was, we need to see and realize that seniors have ADHD, because the likelihood is that they were past school age when they even realized girls could have ADHD. So in today's talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of ADHD, what ADHD looks like, and what ADHD looks like across the lifespan. So you really need to listen to the first episode to get some of the key points, and I am going to move on. So what are some ADHD traits? Well, you'll see that it impacts 3 to 10% of the population. And the reason that we don't have a good number is the majority of people, especially women who have it, are not diagnosed. And seniors especially, they missed that time when we even knew what ADHD was. It is highly heritable. They say it's as heritable as height is. So if you have a family member with ADHD, you need to not just look backwards one generation, but you need to keep looking backwards. And I actually think I've identified it in my grandfather with my mother's father, just some traits and some things that I knew about him. Having said that, school looked very different for our parents and our grandparents than it did for our children, who were being required to sit still longer than they really should be. And so I think we're definitely seeing more of it. We're also more aware of it now. I know I'm talking a lot, Justin. Do you have anything you want to say as I'm moving along?
No, I agree with you, especially on the school thing. It's a real problem, and I have
Yeah,
lots of thoughts on that, but this is not the time nor the place. But
sure.
yeah, no,
Okay.
I think it's good. Hopefully, we get to play more of the games. I like the games.
Oh, all right. I will keep that in mind. I know we ADHD people, we like a good contest. So here's another thing. They used to think that it was just boys that had ADHD and that they would outgrow it. Now we know that that is not true. What they're saying now is that symptoms change based on events and hormones. Women who have estrogen as we are younger, estrogen is pro-cognitive, which means that it helps our brains. And so we're going to be less forgetful. We're going to be able to keep things together. And as we become perimenopausal, you're going to see that the drops in estrogen will affect your memory. And that's a lot of times when women are going to start to be diagnosed. And the other time that women tend to be diagnosed is when their child is diagnosed, which is what happened with me. We already have talked about this before, but boys tended to be more disruptive. So they didn't go underdiagnosed the way that women or girls are underdiagnosed. There are a lot of comorbidities that exist with ADHD, the most common being social anxiety, actually. And then others include anxiety, depression, OCD. And, a lot of times those mask symptoms, and a lot of times having undiagnosed ADHD causes those symptoms to be worse. When we manage the ADHD, a lot of times some of those things are going to get better, but awareness is really, really important. It used to be that we called ADHD ADD if you didn't have the hyperactivity, but now it is all grouped together. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are hyper. It could just mean that you are inattentive. You could have a combined type. I'm actually a combined, which means I've got a little bit of hyperactivity, not to the extent that my brother does, but just enough to keep things spicy and give me enough energy to outrun most people my age. And then I would say that the biggest challenges for people with ADHD tend to be executive functioning and emotional regulation. So we find that a lot of people with ADHD have strained relationships. And oftentimes it's because of our rejection sensitive dysphoria, where we misread signals or we make situations bigger than they need to be. So that is definitely going to be one of the things that we're going to address in this podcast, is how do you handle it when you are more sensitive than other people, and also repairing relationships. Justin and I are currently, he says we're not estranged from our father, but let me just say the relationship is very strained, and we're not getting together for any family holidays. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, it's limited contact is what it
Right.
is. And it boils, and I'll say this because I think because I did write this book. It boils down to boundaries and the inability to respect boundaries. And, here's the thing about it. You don't have to like boundaries, but you have to respect them. If you can't respect them, then, you'll be removed. And unfortunately, without going too deep in the weeds, our father has a tendency to be a bit unkind in some of his words and phrasings towards Jamie's kids and then in front of my kid. And, at the end of the day, as a parent, a grandparent, whatever, it's your job to keep those kids safe.
Sure. So, yes, so Justin is one of the sponsors of the show. In exchange for his time producing, he gets to advertise his book, Boundaries, which I have to say I have read. He wrote it for my adorable niece, Victoria, explaining why it is that her mother, Alyssa, has relationships with her parents, but Justin doesn't have a relationship with his parents. And Justin did an amazing job on his book. I'm really, really going to take a big sister moment and just say how proud I am of my little brother. And that is not teasing. We like to tease each other, but that was genuine. We did.
Well, I appreciate it. And I have a second one that came out, Surprises Are Okay, Secrets Are Not, to help teach kids that adults. It's all, look, again, I do a lot of true crime stuff, and I just don't want to do stories on people's kids. So if it helps save one kid, then that's the goal.
Nice. Okay, cool. And then lastly, go ahead.
That's my plug.
Okay, lastly, the ADHD plugs. This is a big one. It's an explanation, but not an excuse. So I think this podcast and my purpose behind bringing this information is really to educate seniors and their family members about what ADHD looks like. And as my company likes to do, we like to create scaffolding for success. So, okay, now I know I have ADHD. What are some systems that I can put in place so I can live a better life with ADHD? So, and then there's an expression on this slide that I really like by Dr. Ned Hallowell, that if stimulation doesn't occur, we create it. We self-medicate with adrenaline. And he says, our kryptonite is boredom. We do not like to be bored. Penn Holderness, who just wrote the book ADHD is Awesome, calls it borture, which I think is so funny. It's a boredom and torture combined. So, all right. So what's the history of ADHD? So Dr. David Goodman said that you don't suddenly get ADHD for the first time at 60. It's suddenly that we are noticing it. It's that we're getting caught for the first time in older people because of increased awareness. And, just to let you know, and I'm not making this up. I heard a webinar with Dr. Ned Hallowell when he said that it used to be that people with ADHD could actually have been killed because they were thought to be just completely defiant and evil. And they used to think that there were evil spirits that were possessing people with ADHD. And in the 50s, they started calling it minimal brain function or minimal brain dysfunction when they suddenly at least realized that there was something going on with the brain. But, you probably see this in a situation with people with ADHD. You either see the uber successful people who have their hand on a bunch of different things and they have figured out how to channel their ADHD. And you're going to hear a lot of guests on the podcast where that's the case. And then you're sadly going to hear the stories of the kids that because they were bored, they couldn't be in school because if they're not engaged, they're going to disengage, they're going to fail, and then they're going to suddenly feel like they're stupid. But actually, when you really do an IQ test on someone with ADHD, oftentimes we're pretty creative, intelligent people. Would you agree with that, Justin?
Oh, 100%. Yes,
right.
Very much so.
So
and not only creative, but also, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for here? I would say even MacGyver-esque.
Oh, absolutely. You're going to see that in a slide. We're great problem solvers. We're great. We think very well in stressful situations, think ER doctors, because our brains need that stimulation to rise up. So when we have that, we are amazing and able to create amazing things. And in fact, I love that Ned Hallowell says we shouldn't be calling it attention deficit disorder or hyperactivity disorder. We should calling it VAST, which is variable attention stimulus trait. Because what happens is, and Justin, I know you know this, if you are interested in something, everything else falls away and you focus, you're able to hyperfocus. I'm sorry?
Hyperfixation. Yeah.
Right. So it's not true that you can't focus on something. You have to be interested and then you can focus on it. And so that's why a lot of times you would see people who didn't do very well in high school excel in college or programs that they were interested in. Because again, if you are interested in something, you can get it done. So another issue with ADHD is we have some problems with executive functioning. So a lot of the clients that Silver Linings Transitions and I see in our day-to-day work are people who they have clutter everywhere and they don't know where to begin. And part of the problem is that they have a hard time being organized, staying organized, and completing tasks, or knowing where to begin a task is an executive functioning issue. Another problem is managing emotions or impulses. That's very common with ADHD. That's why a lot of us will buy something, or maybe we don't have that filter in our mouth and we'll say something and then we're like, oh, did we just say that? So that's another problem that, what?
Our
Yes.
Father. Except he doesn't ever say, oops, I just said that. He just goes with it.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I go with it too. And I'm like, trouble. That's why I like drinking sometimes, that in vino veritas, in wine there is truth. Sometimes I'm like, oh, it's the wine, not me. Trouble listening or paying attention. Short-term memory issues. Now, this is a good one. And this is one that I have had to learn a coping skill for. I don't know about you, Justin. Do you ever forget where you've parked a car?
Often.
Okay. So that's because we're in our brains and we're not in our bodies. So now I literally have to either take a picture of the parking spot and where I am in proximity to where I'm going, or I will say, okay, be in my body. And I'll stop and I'll start to take in my surroundings. And I have to make a choice to do that.
Don't you have a Tesla?
Yes, but that's too much technology.
I guarantee you the app will tell you where your car's parked, because my Acura and my truck both do that.
Inability to multitask or balance tasks. That's actually not true. I think people with ADHD can do many things at one time. So, and again, I'm going to say this in a lot of episodes. You meet one person with ADHD, you meet one person with ADHD. Not every trait is going to apply to you. This is just a good generalization. And then this is a bad one, but it's true. Socially inappropriate behavior. And I think a lot of times that does come down to not having that filter. Like it just comes out of our mouths and we're like, ooh, I shouldn't have said that. I should have paused. I struggle with the pause. What about you, Justin?
I think a lot of it might also be the inability to recognize social cues in certain cases.
Right. No, I don't have that. I actually have a high EQ, but I do know that it can be the case.
Yeah.
Or also just being so self-absorbed, as in the case for someone we both know, that they don't pay attention to how that is going to impact other people. All right. So we just talked about some of the negatives, but back to what you were saying, the MacGyver quality, Justin, there are some really positive traits that go with ADHD. And now we have to be careful that we don't assign, there's something called toxic positivity and toxic negativity. We want to really carefully line that balance, because, having ADHD isn't all bad and it isn't all good. It's just like in life, it's a balance. Okay. Anyway, but so when Penn Holderness released the book, ADHD is Awesome, there's been a lot of pushback on that, because they said, and he actually, in the interview that I watched with him, he's like, I don't mean that it's awesome, like it's always great. Like it's also like, like, whoa, right? But anyway, the traits of people with ADHD that can be positive are that we don't look at things the same way. We're more imaginative. We're super creative. We can come up with really creative solutions, which is to answer your MacGyver. We have a strong sense of justice, which can lead to not throwing things away. In the last inaugural episode, I talked about breaking a bracelet. Now Justin knows the answer to it. I said, what happens, do you think, Justin, when I break a bracelet, it's got a lot of beads on it? And Justin's first answer was, oh, you throw it away. I'm like, no. What might be another thing that I would do with a broken bracelet? Now, what's the answer, Justin?
Repurpose it.
I repurpose it, right? I think I'm going to repurpose it. So I put it away thinking, oh, one day I'm going to get to it. And then, of course, the one day never comes. We tend to have more energy than the average person. Would you agree with that, Justin?
Yes.
We don't do well with sitting still.
No.
I mean, so that's why we're constantly starting new projects. Our brains need a lot of stimulation and dopamine. And we're resilient, actually. And I'm going to have an episode coming up with Dr. Ken Druck, who is really inspiring. So I'm not going to tell you more about that, but it is a whole episode on resilience. And it is probably the trait that I like the most about having ADHD is my resilience. And Justin and I did not have a great childhood. And the fact that we are here and doing what we're doing today is definitely a tribute to us being resilient, right?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. I don't think we've ever had an episode we've agreed this much. I think it's because I started feeding your ego.
I'm sorry. Next time I'll make sure to disagree, whatever it is.
Okay.
I'm going to be like, absolutely not.
So you're going to agree with this one too. So bright people can have ADHD. In fact, I read that companies that do creative work may want to embrace some messy desk employees, creative geniuses included, and they believe these people had ADHD. Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein. But remember, we weren't testing back then, but all systems indicate that they likely had ADHD, and some of them also had OCD, and those two can actually exist. And it is not uncommon to see ADHD and OCD together in one person. So what does ADHD look like across the lifespan is our next slide. And as I shared, you can see low income, underemployed, legal difficulties, lots of car accidents. Like there are some stuff that is not good. You can see academic issues with relationships. So there's some things that are not really, really good. And you will start to see ADHD in childhood. You will not suddenly develop ADHD as an adult. When you start to look back, you will see some of these common patterns. In fact, when they are looking at seniors and they want to evaluate them, what they are suggesting is that person with ADHD or suspected ADHD comes with a loved one who can sort of be the witness to how this person was in their 40s. Because, it's hard to look at some of the behaviors of being a senior. We do have cognitive decline that comes with aging, whether you have ADHD or not. It's very normal to be a little slower, to be a little more forgetful, even if you're completely aging, normally with no cognitive impairment. But when you have ADHD, you're going to see, memory loss. You're going to see those moments where you completely forget what you were going to say, where you leave, eggs boiling on a stove. And so a lot of times those of us with ADHD need that person to come with us because we don't always remember the things that we did. So again, you're going to see it across the lifespan. And the reason that I named it Grandma Has ADHD is because, again, women tended to not get diagnosed. We didn't even start realizing that girls or females even had it until the 1980s, 1990s. And so it was missed. We flew under the radar. We were the girls in the back that were easily distracted. You can look at your notes. In fact, if you look at my notes, you'll see that I was constantly doodling because I couldn't just pay attention. I had to be doing something else. So you can actually go back into your notebooks and see some of those observations for yourself. So that's that easily distracted. We tended to be a little more sensitive. So you might see a girl with ADHD who cried a little more than the average girl, super talkative. Again, we had problems completing tasks. We tended to have more messy rooms. And then we were a little impulsive. And then lastly, daydream. In fact, funny, I remember I would be sitting at dinner and all of a sudden I would just be staring straight out and just completely leaving where I was, and my kids would freak out. And I do this pretty frequently. I didn't know that was ADHD until more recently, but I would just stare into space and I'm just completely checked out. Can't tell you where I've gone, but that's a very common trait in females with ADHD. And then for seniors, so this you're taken from Dr. Kathleen Nadeau's book. You're going to hear me talk about her quite a bit. Again, she wrote the only book that exists on the subject of seniors with ADHD. We were lucky to have her already as a guest on the podcast. But here are some signs. Again, not all are going to fit, but forget to pay bills, live in a disorganized environment, struggle with depression or anxiety, procrastinate on projects, even ones that initially excite you, have high levels of conflict in family, have a child or a grandchild with ADHD, or a family history of learning disorders. Actually, dyslexia is a very popular learning disorder that can coexist with ADHD. So that is what it really kind of looks like in seniors. And with dementia, so again, I think I shared this.
Next slide, though, because I think this is interesting. I think we ought to leave them on a climactic commercial break.
I think that's a great idea. So with that being said, every once in a while, Justin, this is just your episode. You're going to win the gold star for this one.
That's what I'm doing it for.
Okay. Well,
right, we'll
stay tuned and we'll be right back.
We'll be right back from a word from our sponsors.
If you are listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you or a loved one is feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of ADHD or disorganization. Since those of us with ADHD tend to struggle with where to begin big projects like moving or home organizing, the Silver Linings Transitions team can guide you through the process, breaking tasks down into manageable steps or handling every detail. There's a reason our team carries magic wands when we work with our clients. We can pack and move your entire home and you won't have to miss a day of work or touch a single box. We also provide home organizing and storage sort outs with an understanding of ADHD.
If you have a home to sell, we can provide you free or discounted services when we refer you to one of our realtor partners through our realtor referral program. Visit our website at www.silverliningstransitions.com or call us at 760-522-1624 to learn more about how we can help you make your move or home organizational project magical.
And we are back. So, ADHD and dementia, that is one that a lot of people are really concerned about. Right now, they cannot find a positive correlation between ADHD and dementia. There has been some indication that there could be an increase in Lewy body dementia. That is yet to completely be corroborated. But what they are saying is that there are a lot of lifestyle choices that exist for people who have ADHD that also make dementia more likely. So it's not necessarily that there's a positive correlation, but there are things that we with ADHD do that definitely can contribute to the onset of dementia. So I'm going to give you a few of those. Poor sleep is one that people who develop dementia are more likely to not get adequate sleep. So it's really important that if you have ADHD, even if you don't have ADHD, that you set yourself up to get at least 6 hours of sleep, although better if you can get more. And that really you try to be asleep by 11 o'clock because that is the height of our circadian rhythm. And when we get melatonin for our brains, and melatonin is really, really important for us. So those of us with ADHD tend to ruminate and we'll go into our thoughts and it can be hard to fall asleep. So you need to come up with some ways that you can create a good sleep system for yourself. There's going to be
Melatonin.
Well, right. Ideally, you don't take things unless you have to. I'd rather people form some good habits. We're going to have those on the Grandma Has ADHD website, by the way, some good sleep techniques and things you can do. Another lifestyle choice is smoking. People with ADHD tend to have addiction issues. They're looking for dopamine. It could be food cravings. It could be substance abuse. But those are other things that can lead to an increased risk of dementia. Alcohol use, again, increased risk of dementia. Depression and anxiety, although that's something you can't control, that has also been caused to an increase in dementia. So, and I think that for people with ADHD, we tend to have social anxiety. And so a lot of times there'll be so much fear around being around people or saying the wrong thing that we'll sometimes isolate ourselves. And that's actually something that can be corrected through talk therapy. So social isolation, they have now figured out that it is more detrimental to our health than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. So you need to be connecting with people who understand you. I think finding other people with ADHD who get you like Justin and I, we had many years that we were disconnected for other reasons, but it has been so nice. But wouldn't you say that we have a lot in common and it's just really nice to have someone that just totally understands you.
I would agree. And before you leave the slide, I do want to add something because I do social media creation now and writing, but in a previous life, I worked in medical sales, typically with long-term care facilities. And I'm going to just drop a little bit of knowledge for your listeners because I would imagine that either a large amount of our listeners are going to be seniors themselves or have family members that are seniors, because why else would you be listening to us? But don't take Benadryl.
Oh.
Don't take Benadryl is what's called an anticholinergic. And it affects the blood-brain, long and short, without going into details, affects the blood-brain barrier. And it's not recommended for anybody really over 65, but honestly, 55. And frankly, if you can just avoid it altogether, there are better options out there. So yeah, for cognitive decline, it is associated with cognitive decline. Don't take it.
Thank you. That's a great little piece of advice. And although I had hit do not disturb on my computer, it's still disturbing. And as we talked about in the previous episode, if you haven't heard the term squirrel, that's when somebody with ADHD gets distracted by an external something, and we use the term squirrel. I didn't mention the other important lifestyle choice is exercise. A lot of people with ADHD don't move their bodies the way that they should. And it's really, really important that you're doing something to move your body and then also keeping your brain engaged. People with ADHD don't like boredom, and boredom isn't good for any brain. So that's a little bit of the link between ADHD and dementia. And I do want to also share one thing that I think is important to note is that they have said that they cannot find a correlation between stimulant medication and an increase in dementia. So again, I am not a doctor, as I shared in the inaugural episode. You want to do your research, you want to talk to a doctor, but if you can look into medication for ADHD, if it can improve your life and it's not going to mess with other medical issues, then great. That's part of the problem of the challenge of being a senior and wanting to take medication, is that a lot of times being a senior means that there's a balance of medications and you don't want to take something that's going to affect other medications. So please, please, please talk to a doctor. Do not take my advice on any of this, because I am not a medical doctor.
Once you get past a certain age too, narcotics, which, a lot of ADHD medications are narcotics and controlled substances, and they can be rough on bodies as they age. I mean, I'm in my early 40s and I still won't take them. Just to let people know, there are a lot of really great options out there that are non-narcotic, of course, but for me, they didn't really work for me, or I couldn't handle the side effects like nausea and stuff like that. That just would not go away. So I did some research and found out that, Wellbutrin works as a decent off-label ADHD medication. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but if nothing else, it makes you a little happier and a little bit more organized. So just so people are aware, there are options out there, and don't always stick to the script. Sometimes there are some really great off-label options, but like Jami said, make sure to talk to your doctor about it.
Right. Because again, we're not doctors. So the next slide is ADHD and social anxiety, which I touched on. They actually said that's the number one comorbidity that exists with ADHD. And what social anxiety looks like is afraid of being judged by others. You're self-conscious in everyday social situations. You might avoid meeting new people due to your fear or your anxiety. History of impulse control issues and a lack of filter. I definitely have that lack of filter, but for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to bother me. I don't know why that is. I would not say that I have social anxiety, but I know my mother has social anxiety. I know my oldest child has social anxiety. We likely had a history of being chastised. I think Justin and I both share that. We had that in our family of origin, and it is treatable with talk therapy. So that's really, really good news. So that's a little bit more about social anxiety. And then what is rejection sensitive dysphoria? It means that we tend to be strong people pleasers. We feel more embarrassed or self-conscious than other people. We tend to have a lower self-esteem and self-doubt. We might display sudden outbursts of physical emotions like anger, tears, and sadness. We engage in negative self-talk. You're going to hear Alan P. Brown and you're going to hear Dr. Ken Druck on episodes that are going to talk a lot about that negative self-talk. So I want to make sure that you listen for that, because that's one of the worst things that you can do is talk negatively to yourself. And I will say one of the best things that I ever read was Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul. And he basically said, you think of that little voice in your head that's really nasty as a roommate or a friend. And he's like, would you be friends with that person? And the reality is, if you wouldn't be friends with that person, then, you shouldn't be. You need to figure out some way to disengage from that negative self-talk. It basically is what we need to do. And I know a lot of times it's easier said than done. Other things that we do, we have difficulty managing our reactions. We find it draining to manage relationships. And then we can suddenly become moody or show signs of depression or anxious feelings. So that's a little bit more about rejection sensitive dysphoria. And that is going to be a wrap for today's episode. So more like the history continuation of what we talked about in our inaugural 1 episode. In our next episode, we're going to talk more about, what's the difference between a pack rat, a collector, hoarding disorder, and ADHD, and a few systems that you can put in place. I want to make sure that you continue to stay tuned and listen to further podcasts. So I'm not going to give you every answer to every one of life's mysteries around ADHD, but just give you enough to make your life a little bit better, because when you know better, you can do better. So Justin, anything you want to the end of this second inaugural episode?
Yeah, and I would slightly disagree with you. Thank God I can disagree with you on something. Or you said you're not giving everybody the tidbit, but here's the thing. The reason that you should come back and listen to this is that Jami has done a lot of research and has a lot of experience in this field, in this topic, even if she's not a doctor or certified expert or whatever. Sometimes life experience goes a bit further with that. But what she is doing here, and what the goal is, whether you are a senior living with ADHD or whether you are the family member of a senior living with ADHD, the goal of these episodes is to help, number one, educate you on what's going on, because it can be very, very frustrating, especially for the family members. But two, to give you the tools that you need to help cope and manage living with this, because ADHD can definitely be a gift, but it can also be a curse in many ways if you don't know what you're dealing with. So the goal of this is, she says she's not going to give you the answers, but giving you the tools gives you the answers.
So well said. We do agree. Wow. I think
No, I
this is
disagreed with
the-
you. Absolutely.
I think this is the most we've ever gotten along
No, I
ever
totally disagreed with you on that one.
in 36 minutes. But thank you for listening. We hope you'll come back to the Grandma Has ADHD podcast. If you would like it, subscribe to it, tell your friends about it, and keep listening. We're going to make the rest of your life the best of your life.
And as I said before on the previous episode, definitely go check us out on YouTube. Follow us there. Those episodes will drop a little bit earlier on YouTube. Plus, you get to see, I mean, you can tell this presentation, if you're listening to it and not watching, she worked very hard on this presentation. So I think that, first of all, let's just give you a round of applause for that. And second of all, definitely go in and check out her hard work.
Thanks.
You like my little
Justin.
soundboard? Is that what that is?
I love it. You are awesome.
I appreciate it. All right, well, guys, we will see y'all next time.
The opinions expressed on Grandma Has ADHD podcast are those of our guests and hosts and are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content discussed in this episode is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician, mental health professional, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental health concern. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of Grandma Has ADHD do not assume any liability for the content of this podcast. Listen at your own discretion.